Hello, I'm Dr. Victoria Wright and I'm presenting with Dr. Pete Bennett from University of Wolverhampton. We're presenting on the question, what does it mean to be a student in a HE setting post-pandemic? In terms of my own personal context, so I worked at the University of Wolverhampton for 14 years. I was a manager as well as having been a senior lecturer previously. I've now changed institution and changed job, as you can see. More importantly for this presentation, the context that I'm talking about is based on my own teaching experiences working from levels 4 to levels 8, and it's very particularly focusing on the work with teacher education and continuous professional development practitioners working in further adult and higher education setting.
I'm Pete Bennett. I taught for 20 years in a sixth form college. I'm an English teacher, and for 16 years I've been at the university. I run a top-up degree and an MA, and in both of those courses I've been trying to address student autonomy and agency in higher education, and the work that Victoria and I have done together over the last few years particularly has looked at ways to transform assessment as a way of providing positive, productive spaces for students. And I think that's what we're going to reflect on in our conversation today.
So our aims, as Pete suggested there, to problematise relations of power, recognising that power is everywhere in the spaces between the teacher and the student, and between the teacher, the student, the institution, and the assessments and the practices that they experience. We want to re-enter and rethink that dialogic space of teacher and student, very particularly because through the pandemic, as one example, we moved from face-to-face wholesale to online, and we're thinking about one course that we've both led on, which is the MA Professional Practice and Lifelong Education, a 2-year part-time course. We want to look again at just what education is for and what it is that we do.
And because we believe the medium is the message, we hope that this is exactly the kind of dialogic space that we're trying to encourage. This is a conversation, and it reaches out and hopes to engage in further conversations with anybody who's interested in these issues.
So we're obviously going to be sharing some of our values, some of our personal professional values around teaching and learning. Something that's very important to myself and Pete is to think through ways of participating. How does the student access the space that we've opened up to them? We also want to think about, again, as we've briefly suggested already, this transition that we made from face-to-face to online and just what that did. On the MA in professional practice, we moved from Saturday attendance face-to-face to online in MS Teams, and from our own perspectives, haven't felt that that made much difference to the ways of participating for the students. There's little aspects that we're going to touch on as we go forward though. So we're sharing some of our experiences of teaching, learning and assessment, and we're thinking more particularly around creation. So where are the students allowed to create some of that experience for themselves? How do they inform what is happening, what they're participating in? The vocabulary that we're using is at the bottom there: participation, transformative and emancipatory. And we're just going to talk around those a little bit.
And the word creation comes directly from Gilles Deleuze's challenge. He said, "We do not lack communication. In fact, we have too much of it. We lack creation, resistance to the present."
Participation for us has been it's been interesting watching the students navigate the new space alongside us. So as example, in a reflective practices module called Extending Criticality, which both myself and Pete have written about before, we saw that the students were doing the normal stuff, as in the quieter ones were perhaps more in the chat space and a little less on the camera. The, let's say, the louder ones, being stereotypical, were there, were present, were perhaps leading. So in terms of that kind of overt participation, it was as it would have been in a classroom setting. I think what it made us realise, though, is that the participation is all-encompassing, it's holistic, if we think about it in that way. We were interested in how they were experiencing the learning environment, in fact, how they were experiencing all of those interactions with content, with the experience of the module itself. Transformative is something that, as education professionals, you will recognise that we wanted to provoke a shift in their thinking. We wanted to support them in being challenged, in pushing themselves. Emancipatory, again, coming back to creation as well. Where is that agency for themselves? What space are they allowed to create?
And the context of this module was, in fact, critical theory. And it's about using ideas in the way that you see fit. And interestingly, two things that come to mind. Derrida said there is no participation without belonging. That's important. And I'm remembering that Marx said emancipation was about restoring the world to people. And I think partly this job is about giving this thing back.
The quotation that we've got on the slide there is one that certainly I've used before. You need to understand and order the meaning for your experiences and integrate them with what you know in order to avoid the threat of chaos. I think the pandemic was obviously, I mean, for everybody, it was incredibly traumatic. It was the threat of chaos. We had to do a lot of learning, even though we were digitally literate. Actually, you still have to do a lot of learning because you're navigating a new mode for teaching and learning in our particular cases. And it was interesting to see how the students interacted in that space with us. I'm going to make one reference to a direct example. So on the module that we've been talking about already, we were in the students' private spaces. They were in our private spaces. So we were seeing literally their domestic setting, wherever it was that they were participating from. I think that created an even more social dynamic, and that's for most BMP to really value the social side of learning. I'm interested in just reflecting on that a little bit in terms of the interaction that perhaps it enhanced.
And that really goes straight to the heart of what Illich was saying 50 years ago. He said provocatively, most learning is not the result of instruction. It is rather the result of a really great phrase, unhampered participation in a meaningful setting. He goes on to say most people learn best by being with it. And again, you know, that was a real prompt for the work that we were doing. How can we allow students to be with their learning? How can we break down the unhelpful and unnecessary barriers? The pandemic provided an opportunity at least to try because we had to.
Plato refers to disruptive hooks. I think that's a very useful expression, that these disruptions, the disruption that we experience there, so from face to face to absolutely entirely online, that disruption challenges us then to the degree of questioning our beliefs, our values, or even our identities, but also creating that opportunity for professional learning. And really, we're taking up that opportunity in this as well, in talking to you now, thinking, okay, so we had obviously formed habits and practices in our face-to-face teaching. We translated some of those into online. It's interesting to just hold that kind of moment for a while and think, what is it we are actually doing now as teacher with student? Where are the students allowed to inform that experience and the content more directly than perhaps we allowed them to previously?
So the challenge really is to not allow this opportunity to pass. One of the most indicative moments for me of the whole process was when exams were cancelled the first time. Many colleges immediately stopped teaching their students, as if without exams there was no reason to learn anything. And I think that's kind of a warning that the world that we had before the pandemic is not necessarily the world we want to return to, a world dominated by formal assessment. The stuff on the screen is stuff that Michael and I wrote this year in a piece which was called The Global Pandemic Did Not Take Place, as a provocation, because if we do return to what's sometimes called the old normal, then in a sense it will not have taken place. Instead, we must, I think, embrace that understanding that Michael expresses in the third part of the quote. We're in this kind of territory in response to the pandemic where so much human understanding is out of its depth. We mustn't be frightened by that. We must take a deep breath and embrace it, I think.
One very practical thing that we had to think about was actually the virtual learning environment that supported the module sessions in MS Teams. So it made us much more mindful that actually, as this quotation says, students had to engage in higher levels of self-motivated and self-directed learning. We were using the virtual learning environment more as a resource area, as an area where we were uploading little videos of ourselves talking about the module and talking about its assessments. All of these kinds of things they had to navigate and find for themselves. We weren't going to be there alongside them or down the corridor in a classroom space. I think what we found ourselves doing was putting more prompts in there, putting in extra little bits of support, and in effect putting in more of a variety of support. So you could read this, you could watch that as examples.
And I think we wanted to problematize the discourse that suggested this was a problem with online learning. This wasn't a problem with online learning. This was a problem with what the system that we had before had delivered in terms of autonomous consciousness in students, and to some degree autonomy and agency in teachers. That some of the panic at the start of the lockdowns was not to do with faulty IT skills. It was to do with teachers who'd been micromanaged and had not had any recent experience of making decisions for themselves, and also a body of students who had been in a system that had been preparing them endlessly for tests, and again had not provided those things.
Just returning again to the assessment and still thinking of this same module, one that we have both written about before. The assessment is, I would say, much more holistic. They have to bring themselves to that assessment. It's a flyer and an artifact, multimodal artifact with a presentation. The students choose experiences in their teaching and learning, their education professional context, and they are invited to reframe, rethink those experiences through theoretical lenses. We obviously provide some reading to them, but they can bring any reading they would like to it. We give them particular concepts that they might draw on in order to kind of boundary the assessment for themselves, make it feel perhaps more comfortable for them to complete it. But they are absolutely bringing themselves to it. And this quotation that you see in front of you, so it says, assessment is neither value free nor culture free. It is a social construct. We still have some regulations attached to it. We've still got the assessment criteria for an MA, for a level 7 module, but the space that we've provided with the assessment type is expansive. This is one of the reasons I think why it tends to get higher marks, because once the students do control that space for themselves, they decide for themselves what it is they want to talk about, then usually all of the rest happens.
Our critique really is that as a relief system, assessment ought to support learning, but it no longer supports learning because, in Habermas's sense, it's become disconnected from the life world. And Habermas said that systems that become disconnected ultimately become pathological. And my strongest version of the heading of this slide was assessment traduces learning. I moderated it to confounds. We said in our work on the module that Victoria's been talking about on the right-hand side, it was vital for us to address the ways in which assessment had become the sine qua non, a position once reserved for learning or even thinking. The starting point in many educational contexts, rather than being content or learning, is in fact assessment, subjecting all of it to its dark greed. As subjects of education, assessment renders us discrete, both apart and apart. And the quote is from Madison: "We are not simply subjects, but we are subjects in dialogue with others." So it is about reconstituting that relationship, even really questioning the renaming of students as learners, which simply puts them in a kind of industrial relationship with teachers. Teachers are the most significant learners in every classroom. That's part of, that's not playing with words, that's using words appropriately.
Continuing forward, I think something that we would think more carefully about is the ways in which the students also interact with the feedback that they're given. So the particular assessment we're talking about, peers gave feedback to each other, we as tutors gave feedback to the students. I'm interested in the quotation around feedback literacy, and thinking that there are some more steps to make in terms of creating a space in which the students can participate. And one of those spaces is actually in the feedback, and it is potentially in saying to them, what is it you want feedback on? What can we support you in there for? How do you want us to go forward? What do you want to take from it for yourselves?
And that is also reaffirming the collective rather than the individual. We take very, very seriously Berardi's warning about the next major issue being what he calls the autonomy of knowledge, the way in which higher education in particular is being created as a place of competition. You know, he says in that middle quotation, education is being transformed into a space of mere acquisition for specialized knowledge, a space where individualism and competition are cultivated to the detriment of solidarity and consciousness. And he puts it very, very bleakly. If the trend towards the separation of technical formation and critical education goes on, by the second generation, no trace of autonomous self-consciousness will be left in the social brain. And he says the autonomy of knowledge is not a philosophical issue, it's a social issue. And one of the themes of our presentation, I'm pleased to say, having felt it, is the notion of the social. That is the key to everything.
On that note, thank you very much for listening to us, and hopefully we've given you some thought-provoking suggestions.